In 1973, a Stanford psychologist and 7 perfectly sane colleagues walked into psychiatric hospitals, faked a single symptom, and were instantly locked up. The staff never caught them. This experiment didn't just expose a flaw in psychiatry, it asked a question that still haunts us. Can we really tell sanity from madness? To understand the Rosenhan experiment, you need to understand the world it entered. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, psychiatry was under siege. Critics like Thomas Schaas argued that mental illness was a myth, a label society used to control nonconformists. Anti-psychiatry movements were gaining momentum, fueled by exposés of horrific conditions in asylums and the rise of powerful drugs like thorazine that could sedate patients into submission. At the same time, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the Bible of Psychiatry, was in its 2nd edition. Its diagnostic criteria were vague, subjective, and heavily influenced by psychoanalytic theory. A diagnosis like schizophrenia could be applied to almost anyone who seemed withdrawn, odd, or uncooperative. There was no blood test for depression, no brain scan for bipolar disorder. Diagnosis relied almost entirely on clinical judgment, and that judgment, as Rosenhan would demonstrate, was deeply fallible. Rosenhan recruited 8 pseudo-patients, including himself, a psychology graduate student, a pediatrician, a painter, and a housewife. None had any history of mental illness. Their instructions were simple: call the hospital, report hearing a voice that said empty, hollow, or thud, and say nothing else about their lives that was false, except for their names and occupations. They were to answer all other questions honestly, describing their actual life histories, relationships, and emotions. Once admitted, they were to stop simulating any symptoms and behave completely normally. The results were immediate and startling. All 8 pseudo-patients were admitted. 7 were diagnosed with schizophrenia, and 1 with manic-depressive psychosis. Despite reporting only a single, vague auditory hallucination, they were kept hospitalized for an average of 19 days. 1 patient stayed for 52 days. None were ever identified as imposters by the hospital staff. Once labeled schizophrenic, everything the pseudo-patients did was interpreted through that lens. When they took notes, as many did to record their observations, staff wrote in charts. Patient engages in writing behavior. When they walked the halls out of boredom, it was noted as anxiety. When they asked normal questions about their treatment, it was seen as paranoid. The label didn't just describe behavior, it defined it. This phenomenon, called diagnostic overshadowing by later researchers, means that once a diagnosis is assigned, clinicians tend to interpret all subsequent behavior as consistent with that diagnosis, even when it's perfectly normal. It's a cognitive bias that can trap both patients and professionals. The label becomes a filter, coloring every observation. For the pseudo-patients, this meant their sanity was invisible. For real patients, it means their normal moments are often overlooked, reinforcing the very diagnosis that keeps them stigmatized. Rosenhan didn't stop there. He conducted a follow-up study that was even more damning. He told a teaching hospital that over the next 3 months, 1 or more pseudo-patients would attempt to gain admission. The hospital staff, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, were asked to rate each incoming patient on a scale of 1 to 10, estimating the likelihood they were a pseudo-patient. In reality, Rosenhan sent no pseudo-patients at all. Yet out of 193 patients admitted during that period, 41 were confidently identified as imposters by at least 1 staff member, and 23 were suspected by a psychiatrist. In other words, real patients with genuine mental illness were being labeled as fakes because the system was so paranoid about being fooled. Rosenhan famously concluded, "It is clear that we cannot distinguish the sane from the insane in psychiatric hospitals." The result wasn't just a failure of diagnosis, it was a failure of trust. The study, published in Science in 1973, was an instant sensation. It was covered by the New York Times, Time magazine, and television news. But it also provoked a furious backlash from the psychiatric establishment. Robert Spitzer, a prominent psychiatrist who later led the development of DSM-III, wrote a blistering critique. He argued that Rosenhan's pseudo-patients were not sane in any meaningful sense. They had lied to gain admission, which itself could be seen as pathological. He also pointed out that the study was unethical, pseudo-patients were subjected to treatment they didn't need, and real patients were deceived. More fundamentally, Spitzer argued that the study's design was flawed. The The pseudo-patients knew they were faking, the staff did not. This asymmetry, he said, made the experiment a test of deception, not of psychiatric competence. The debate raged for years, splitting the field between those who saw the study as a wake-up call and those who dismissed it as a stunt. Nearly 50 years later, the Rosenhan experiment still resonates. It forced psychiatry to confront its own subjectivity, leading to major reforms like the development of structured diagnostic interviews and the DSM-III emphasis on specific criteria. Yet the core question remains, can we ever fully separate mental illness from the quirks of human personality? Today, with the rise of neuroimaging and genetic testing, some believe we're closer to objective diagnosis. But the truth is, no brain scan can read a person's inner experience. The line between sanity and insanity is still blurry, shaped by culture, context, and perspective. Rosenhan's study reminds us that labels are powerful, they can heal or harm. It challenges us to hold our judgments lightly, to see the person behind the diagnosis, and to recognize that in the vast spectrum of human behavior, we all have moments that might be called crazy. If you found this exploration of the Rosenhan experiment valuable, share it with someone curious about the mind. Until next time, keep questioning what we think we know.